There's a lot to discuss, so let's get right to our panel. Joining me here in the studio is Julianne Malveaux. She is an economist, author, and political commentator. Also with us, John Sitilides. He is a government affairs specialist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. Joining us too in Washington is Rafael Bernal. He is a writer for the political newspaper The Hill, and with us too is CGTN White House correspondent Nathan King. Welcome all of you to the show. Nathan, why don't we start with you, because it's interesting, we're still a year out, but this really is kind of crunch time. We're starting to see the winnowing of the field. Beto O'Rourke just dropping out. We'll probably see that accelerated to a certain extent. What do you expect to see in the coming weeks as we head towards Iowa and New Hampshire?
It's always crunch time in American politics, isn't it? Because you have this perpetual campaign. People are always campaigning for the next presidency. But you are right, we are approaching there. I would say just a word of caution. This time, last election cycle, among the Republicans, we had Herman Cain, do you remember him? Yeah. And Ben Carson as the leaders in the race. So flip it to the Democrats. What I do think is different, though, about this race is that you have essentially two front runners right now. You have Joe Biden, known across the United States as Barack Obama's vice president, a safe pair of hands. This is essentially, if you look at all polls of electability, even in swing states where Donald Trump has a built-in advantage, Biden comes up well. And then you have Elizabeth Warren and or Bernie Sanders, essentially the more progressive wing of the party. And if you look at their electability against Trump, there are question marks. But remember, this is not about electing the president just yet, it's about selecting a candidate. And there are many, many Democrats who want a progressive candidate that basically can energize them and make a huge, stark difference between Trump's America and their vision of what they want America to be.
And we've got Buttigieg, who's talking about a generational change as well. In fact, we've seen some fireworks of late between Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren, and he took his shots at her, and Warren responded. Let's listen to what she had to say in Iowa just recently.
Political pundits and even people in our own party don't want to admit it. They think that running a vague campaign that nibbles around the edges is somehow safe. But if the best Democrats can offer is business as usual after Donald Trump, Democrats will lose.
Julianne, let me talk to you about what she said, because you're going to start seeing these stark differences, and they're going to start staking out points of attack against one another. We saw this with Senator Harris, where she landed these blows on Joe Biden. It seemed like everybody was talking about her. It hurt him, but in a sense, it hurt her as well. Yeah. So is this a perilous track for these people to be taking?
Well, they're attacking each other, which is very interesting. But as they attack each other, they're wounding each other. And in wounding each other, you know, who do we end up with? Now, Nathan is right. If you look at this a year ago, you had all these 17 Republicans in the race, remember? And, you know, and now we have a dozen or so Democrats. We're going to see another 3 or 4 drop out, I think, before the end of the year. I think that the stark issue for Democrats is, do you want business as usual or do you want something progressive? And the challenge is that both on the right and on the left, most people really are centrist. Most people do not want anything revolutionary. They don't necessarily want Medicare for all. They want to keep their health plans. Many don't even want, you know, 15 an hour, which, you know, obviously on the progressive end, we want that. I count myself as a progressive. But, you know, many people are like, well, what about the business case for that? So it's gonna be an interesting couple of months. The big thing is, let's not just look at Iowa and New Hampshire. Those are lily white states where you get very little, you know, input from people of color. What's really going to tell us what happens in South Carolina, because that comes after the Iowa, New Hampshire, and that's a place where you have more African Americans, probably nearly half of the Democratic vote. So that, you know, and people keep forgetting, African Americans are the backbone of the Democratic Party. We represent literally half of Democratic voters, and so you know, it's going to be interesting to see. So many of us don't take Iowa, New Hampshire. We're like, okay, that's the white folks' primary. Now, you know, now we'll look at you know, South Carolina.
Well, let's white-haired guys talk to one another for a minute or two, John, because I think maybe you're old enough to remember this. 1972, the progressive candidate ran against Richard Nixon. George McGovern won one state. It was a blowout, and I think Democrats think back on that, at least the older ones, and worry about having a candidate that's too progressive, that doesn't tack enough to the center, whereas millennials are just yearning for a progressive candidate. They want it in Bernie Sanders. They like it in Elizabeth Warren. Is that a trap for Democrats in a sense.
It could be, but keep in mind that in 2019, going into 2020, I think we have a Democratic Party that certainly pulled far more to the left as a larger entity than was the case back in 1972, when you only really had a small sliver of the party that really moved in that direction as a result of the tumult of the 1960s. Now it's more institutionally baked into the party. So I think you probably will have somebody who's far more on the left part of the spectrum than would have otherwise been the case. However, to Julianne's point, I think there's also a different perspective in terms of how the first states will winnow out the candidates. Iowa, remember, may be demographically distinct in other parts of the country when it comes to the Democratic primary, but Barack Obama was able to win Iowa and to demonstrate to the country, especially to the Democratic Party, that he was somebody who could be the standard bearer for the entire party precisely because of Iowa's demographics.
You know, it gave him a huge boost.
Absolutely.
And Kamala
absolutely.
has decided she's putting all her effort now in Iowa. She's taken people out of New York, out of other places, and so she's basically throwing the dice on Iowa.
But just to close the point there, even though there is a demographic diversity issue to deal with in the Democratic Party, donors will watch to see what happens to candidates. And if you're not clustered in the top 1, 2, or 3 positions and the donors start to drop off, it doesn't matter where the voters are 3 or 4 states down the line, you're forced because you've run out of money to drop out of the race. So I think it's going to be very interesting once those initial primaries are in, then it winnows very, very quickly and we'll see who endures.
And Rafael, let me go to that point because as you were pointing out, Senator Harris, basically this is her last stand. She's putting all of her eggs in one basket, Iowa, but she's not alone. Julian Castro, the former secretary in the Obama administration, also came out today and said he was pulling people out of other states and he was putting as much effort as he can into Iowa. It's kind of make or break for some of these candidates, isn't it?
So those 2 candidates specifically, they have their strategy is to make it to California because California moved up its primary, but that's until March. So they have to make it through Iowa with a donor base that sort of lets them keep a campaign rolling. And remember, Democrats sort of have to build their own structures. Republicans tend to look to become popular to then hang on to the party structure, which President Trump didn't do, by the way. But those 2 cases, if they make it to California, Julian Castro, because he's very popular with Latinos, and remember, that same day with California comes Texas and Virginia and these big states, that's Super Tuesday. And Kamala Harris, because she is from California, they expect that to start their relaunch their campaign. But that would imply that they're betting on a very divided field. And as Warren and Biden seem to become sort of the front runners, they'll start and possibly I think Sanders is in the mix for that as well. They'll start picking up more and more in these early states, and it's unlikely that they'll both make it to California. And if they do, I don't see if their plan pans out unless one of them really comes out with just an overwhelming number of delegates.
So Julianne, let's talk about that because the candidates of color, we've talked about Harris, we've talked about Castro, Cory Booker as well, and I've seen him speak. He's a very dynamic speaker. They just haven't caught fire. Why do you think that is?
I have no idea. I mean, African-American women of a certain demographic, older African-American women, are extremely loyal to Biden. Partially because of his relationship with President Obama, but also because they're used to him. He's the person they know. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Kamala just hasn't, she's good people. I know her personally. I like her very much. She hasn't caught on. Similar, Castro, Buttigieg is doing very well. I mean, much better than one might have predicted. But the proof of the pudding is going to be, Iowa. Now, Cory Booker, he's a great speaker. He's a good guy. He's got great ideas. He actually has introduced some Senate legislation around reparations, which is one of the issues that I care a lot about, although it's not a big national issue, but I care about it. And he basically introduced some legislation, which was a risk for him. So I appreciate his work, but I just think somehow it just hasn't caught fire. And the kumbaya stuff he does also. I mean, people are not loving the kumbaya. He loves everybody.
Vegan. I mean, you can't be president of America as a vegan.
Well, you can be the president as a
Not
vegan.
yet.
But I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, the great big burger is kind of
Yeah, exactly.
It's who you want to have a beer with, not beef. It is a key constituent, though, and the black voter turnout rate declined for the first time in 20 years in the presidential election, falling 59.6 in 2016 after reaching a record high of 66.6 in 2012. You've talked about it. It's a very important constituency. How do these candidates go out and get it?
Well, I mean, now I may get in trouble for this, but Hillary Clinton lost the election. And because for many reasons. She was not the best candidate, and everyone realized that. What I think has to happen for the Democratic Party is they need to learn the lessons of 2016, which is don't count on people. Don't count on any constituency. African Americans, of course, huge part of that. But, you know, Republicans and Trump are completely right. Why didn't Hillary Clinton go to Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania? These should be Democratic heart grounds that you go and you say thank you and turn up and energize, and they did not do that. They ran their campaign, a data-driven campaign from Brooklyn, of all places. You know, I used to live in Brooklyn. You're not going to get any more votes in Brooklyn, all right? So, you know, I think it's about re-energizing. This is where Joe Biden connects, right? He's considered basically a blue-collar politician. He's from Delaware. He took Amtrak every day. He's good on the stump in Michigan. He's good in Pennsylvania. He's good in Wisconsin. And if, you know, his health holds up, which it looks like he's doing, he can campaign. Same for Elizabeth Warren. Their campaign is fantastic. Going around the country, grassroots rallies, signing everyone up. People have been waiting hours and hours and hours in line for a selfie. She stands there, takes the selfies. Bernie Sanders, not so much. You know, he's had some health problems, but I think that's it, is the energizing with the Democratic base, and especially looking for cracks in the Trump coalition. White working class women that are really alienated with Trump right now. College graduates, very much Democrats, but business owners who have suffered perhaps at the tariffs, but also farmers who are worried about the tariffs, and also people who do want a sort of moral code when you're in the White House. Those are where the Democrats sort of can get the votes. And just one final point, the 2018 midterms were basically an indication of where Democrats can win. They won 40 seats to take control of the House of Representatives. None of those seats were in Elizabeth Warren territory. None of them were in Bernie Sanders territory. All of them were in Joe Biden territory. That sort of middle of the electorate, exactly what Joanne was saying at the beginning. That's where elections are won.
But, you know, it was Trump territory, you know, as well. It wasn't just Biden territory. It was Trump territory. The women who won in Virginia, I mean, they were winning in places where
But they're moderate candidates
Yeah.
who can swing these important districts, not just the states, but these important districts, which essentially decide American elections. We know that. It's not just down to 3 states. Sometimes it's down to like 10 or 12 counties, you know?
Rafael, you were going to jump in?
There's an additional place. Texas is becoming more and more of a battleground. You see a lot of Republicans retiring. And the reason behind that is there are 4 million, nearly 4 million eligible non-voting Latinos that the Democrats are actually appealing to as a result of what happened with Beto O'Rourke in the 2018 race, where he just, in some counties, he had 300% more people, more Latinos voting in 2018 than he had in 2014. So Democrats are actually, they're fighting for those Joe Biden voters in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, if you want to call it that. But they're also fighting for these voters in Texas, Arizona, who haven't been pulled out, who haven't been registered, who haven't been taught to vote. And these voters can actually make a pretty big difference, if nothing else, to make Republicans spend money in Texas, which they generally never expect to do in a presidential.
You know, it's interesting, John, I was listening to 3 Republican strategists talking about this campaign on the Democratic side, and all 3 of them said, you know, pick a senator from Massachusetts who's a professor, who sips Merlot. We'd love to run against that person. And you see all of this stuff about Ukraine and Biden. It seems to me Trump is more worried about Biden than Warren or anybody else on the Democratic side. Is that safe to say? I mean, when the Trump campaign's looking at a candidate, who do they not want to face off against?
I think they would not want to face off against Joe Biden. And there's a good argument to be had that in 2016, if Biden were the nominee, he probably would have beaten Trump.
Absolutely.
But the thing is, it's difficult to see how Biden becomes the candidate given where primary voters are in the Democratic Party right now. So the donor class is certainly behind Biden. There are constituencies that know Joe Biden for the 30-plus years he's been in politics and the 8 years he served under President Obama. But the primary voters, to the degree that they're energized by Elizabeth Warren, by Representative Ocasio-Cortez, they want to hear about exciting, forward-looking policy ideas, and Joe Biden keeps slipping up when he's talking about what he was doing in the 60s and 70s and 80s. So I think he would be an exceptional general election candidate against Trump, but I don't see how he gets there. Ultimately, the primary process is about the last candidate standing. You don't have to win every primary or every caucus. You just have to be the last one standing.
Two things I just want to add here is that Trump's kind of going through his own primary right now, and that's going to be the impeachment process.
Exactly.
You know,
If it even takes place.
Well,
and there's a
But
good
the
argument
drip,
to be
drip
had.
every
No,
day,
but I'm just saying,
it's gonna, it has to hurt.
He is testing the loyalty of the Republican Party in both Washington and outside, because a lot of these Republicans who are running for re-election will have to decide very quickly whether they're going to be 100% with Trump or not. And this is quite interesting as well. We've seen his numbers weaken within the party in the last few weeks, from 95% approval rating down to 82%, I think, depending on which poll you read. But the other flip side of this, and this is where most Americans voters, we know that Americans are far too busy to start comparing healthcare plans of 17 different Democratic candidates, right? They look at their paychecks, they look at whether their kids can get into college, they look at their medical bills, and they say, am I doing better than I were 4 years ago? And the answer is yes, the economy is doing really well, and that is a strong thing for the US president to run on if he can get over this impeachment.
Well, I mean, it's doing well for some people.
Right.
I mean, the unemployment rate certainly is down. It's lower than it's ever been.
Right.
But when you look at wage increases, it's not there. I mean, the top, I'd say maybe 30% are doing very well, but the bottom, maybe 40% are not. But to the base point that I want to make, I want to talk a little bit about millennials, because they did not come out in 2016.
Exactly.
They wanted Bernie, and they didn't
sat
want
on their
Hillary.
hands.
And they were very excited about Bernie. Bernie could have done a better job of being more enthusiastic about Hillary, but he didn't. There was bad blood there. But in any case, I think we do have to look at millennial voters, because they're a whole different ballgame. I mean, they don't respond to the same, basically incentives that others do. I know when I talk to young African Americans, I mean, we all came up with the trope, somebody died for your right to vote. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. They want to hear, what are you going to do for me lately? What are you going to do for me today? And Biden does not excite the millennials. Now, they're not the overwhelming majority of Democratic voters, but they do make a difference.
Let me ask you, Rafael, about what she brings up here. The Bernie supporters not enthusiastic about Hillary. Is the Democratic Party, is it going to have that same sort of problem this time around? I did hear one person within the party say, look, you don't need to excite the base. They'll go and vote because they can't stand Trump. But is that enough?
I think the Trump factor is going to be very strong, because in 2016, Trump was a bit of an abstract. Nobody believed he could win until he won. So the fear of Trump really didn't push that many voters. And Hillary was a very unlikable candidate for those voters who didn't like her. Those voters who did like her loved her. And they went out and voted, and they believed, the presidency was hers to have. But Bernie voters are probably, if it's Elizabeth Warren, they'll be pretty easily convinced. And even if it's not, Trump factor will be bigger. The people of color will probably come out stronger no matter who the Democrat is. And that's another element that's ironically hurting Castro and Harris. They may represent people of color. For instance, Castro's very popular among Latinos, like extremely popular. But they don't see, Latinos don't see it necessary to have a Latino in the White House to represent them. And for instance, Bernie Sanders is also very popular among Latino millennials. So the Democrats are a little bit canceling each other out, and they're hoping, and they're probably right, that Trump will be enough to to send one candidate's voters to whoever the nominee is.
John?
Well, right now this seems to be a four-person race in the Democratic Party, right? And your reporter put out the top four. I don't think really Kamala Harris or Julian Castro really have a chance here. They may be good vice presidential material, but they're pretty much out of the running right now. It's difficult to see how they break out into the top ranks. What's going to be fascinating, to the point I think that everyone here is raising, is how will the Democratic primary voters, the ones that are energized to come out, especially to caucuses, which is a whole different ballgame, very different than just the primary voting process, and to see whether or not they're more motivated by going after Donald Trump, which some numbers show as much as 80% of Democratic primary voters just want a candidate who can beat Donald Trump more than a candidate whose policy positions are aligned with theirs. And then there are the millennials who maybe don't only want to beat Trump, but really do care about where the country's going to be going in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years. How does that work out inside this primary process? So I would say it's very much up in the air, outcome-wise, except that one of these four will likely be the one that goes to California and reigns supreme.
It's interesting. In 2004, I was in Iowa, and we did a story at the time. How many candidates can you see in one day? We've got like 5 presidential candidates, and that was by noon. But at the time, Howard Dean, I remember going and covering him. He only had one staffer with him, and she had convinced another staffer, a friend of hers, to come along and pretend to be a staffer. He had no apparatus whatsoever. John Kerry was the guy who was. And then it flipped, and Dean all of a sudden was the front runner. But then as you got closer to the actual caucus, you saw Dean and Gebhardt mixing it up, and both of them came down, and Kerry actually got more of the delegates. So I look at the polling now, and you see Biden may be hurting, but as people know, and a lot of our viewers may not know, you go to the caucus, I may want Klobuchar, but there's not enough votes for Klobuchar. I've got to pick somebody else. It's a very peculiar system. And things like that can happen. Are we putting too much stock in the polling at this stage?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We really are. I mean, the Iowa caucuses require you to give a full day's investment in the process. It's not like you're going into the booth and pulling a lever. You're there all day. So you have to be highly motivated. And that's why I think Kamala and Castro are spending more money there, but you're right, it's not going to pull them out of the top. The top four are really the top four.
But also, you know, black swans. We always have black swan style events in elections. You know, Bernie Sanders' heart attack, for example, is a unfortunate but a black swan moment. What if suddenly Donald Trump replaces Mike Pence as a running mate and thinks, I'll bring in someone like Nikki Haley? You know, what if, for example, the economy gets a really big hit and we see a recession looming in the middle of next year? All these things are much more likely to affect an election. What if we're at war? You know, an election than any one particular candidate, whatever they're doing in Iowa. And a lot of candidates know this. You know, they campaign, but it's events, which will essentially decide this election.
Rafael, a question for you. You know, something that was unique in the last presidential election, the work of Cambridge Analytica, voter suppression, digital disinformation, Russian bots. Are we going to see all of that? I mean, is there going to be a disruption with this election process?
Well, it seems almost inevitable. If the Russians did it once, and it's pretty clear that they did, and other international actors might want to jump into the mix, but the Russians seem to have be more enthusiastic about interfering in foreign elections than anyone else. If we saw it once, it's likely to happen again. There hasn't been any legislation on the matter. The Department of Homeland Security, which traditionally would be the one to take charge of that, has been very focused on immigration. And frankly, I mean, if all the theories are right, the Russians supported the president who's running for re-election. The administration will have less motivation to stop them if they find something, unless it's a criminal wrongdoing, in which case theoretically they'd be obligated to try and stop it. So yeah, you can count on disinformation, but you can also count on the voters will be slightly more educated. Finland has, for instance, they're teaching their voters to identify false information on the internet, and they've been apparently very successful. Here we don't have such a program, but voters now know it exists. Like it's been in the media so much that some voters are looking out for false information, and I think it'll be harder to pull a fast one on many voters, as it were.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there. I apologize. We've run out of time, but it's been a great freewheeling discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. We're going to have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us.